Based on my research trip to Transylvania a few years ago, I tonight share what I learned from the daughter of a village wise woman. That the monsters of this fascinating Romanian country aren't so much vampires, but the Strigoi. Terrifying, undead entities that terrorize their surviving relatives. And I'm about to share a shocking true-life case of what ghoulish lengths some families will go to protect themselves from the terror of the Strigoi. A few years ago, I spent some time in Transylvania, which is, by the way, an actual place in Romania. Some people seem to think it's a fictional country created for horror stories, but no, it is very real. And the name means the land beyond the forest. I was there researching the bizarre and frightening folklore of the country, and one cold February night, I was sitting in a tiny tavern in a traditional Saxon village called Chasnadoara, and I was interviewing a woman called Doris, who was the daughter of the village wise woman. And as I took my seat to hear her stories, I made an assumption. I knew that Transylvania is famously known as the home of Count Dracula from Bram Stoker's iconic novel. I'd visited some of the sites connected with Dracula on that trip, perhaps a story for another frightful one of these nights. And yet, as I sat there, sipping a local drink called Zwika, she didn't really talk about vampires. Rather, she used a different word to describe a frightening creature that haunts the cemeteries and villages and houses of this beautiful yet mysterious land. And I also learned that this was not just colorful folklore. You see, some here believed in these creatures so much that they would go to horrifying lengths to stop their attack. I'm Peter Laws, and tonight on Frightful, we encounter the terror of the Strigoi. In December 2003, a man called Petre Toma died. He lived in a remote village in southwestern Romania called Maratuni de Sus. And his life had been troubled with alcohol and ill health, and he eventually died at the age of 76. Some reports say that he fell from his horse and cart while drunk, and his horse stepped on his head and crushed it. However it happened, the family were of course sad to see him die, but they started to notice that something was very wrong after he was buried in the new year. You see, Petre had left a sister called Mirela Maranescu, and her husband Gorge became very worried when Petre was laid to rest because Gorge started to witness his family becoming very ill. Curious to know the cause, Gorge was shocked to hear witnesses make a startling claim. They had seen the dead man Petre leaving the daughter's house just before sunrise. Soon after this, the family started to have very strange dreams. The old man Petre would return in these dreams at night and suck the life from them. Gorge's daughter seemed to be the prime target. Sometimes she would break out into a panic in sleep, shouting, "He's on top of me! He's eating me! He's killing me!" After such incidents, she couldn't even stand on her own feet. She was so weakened by these dream attacks. But were they dreams? Gorge thought otherwise. He was convinced that in death, Petre had become what is known as a Strigoi. These are troubled and tortured spirits who rise from the grave, usually because they have had some sort of unfinished business to attend to, and they can hound and torment the living and feed on them, or cause them great suffering, even death. You might imagine that the people around Gorge's family would think his ideas insane, but the people he told believed him. And more than that, they agreed that to protect the Maranescu family, something would have to be done about Petre, who was sending out his malicious spirit from beyond the grave and draining the family dry. What they did next made headlines across Romania. By the way, if you'd like to know more about my time in Transylvania, then you might want to check out my nonfiction book, The Frighteners, which explains why it's perfectly natural and normal to be drawn to the morbid, spooky, and macabre. That is the English paperback edition. This is the American hardback edition, and here is the super cool Taiwanese edition. Right, back to the Strigoi. It was a cold night. when Gorge led 5 local men to a lonely cemetery at the edge of the village, just before midnight. They gathered around Petri's grave and then they started to dig. It took them a while because exhuming a grave is tiring work. But they finally reached the casket and prized it open with tools. And they took a breath and dragged the body out. And they were afraid by what they saw. They later told reporters that Petri did not look like a dead man at all. His face was red, his beard had grown, and fresh blood was slick around his mouth. Believing that Gorge's theory had been proved, the men took a pitchfork and carefully placed the tips against Petri's chest, and then they rammed it down into the corpse. Once they were deep enough, they jimmied and prized until eventually they were able to split his ribcage open with a crack. And they prized it apart to make a grim doorway. And then one of the men got lower and knelt across the ravaged body. He reached inside, through the broken skeleton and wound, and he rummaged around until he found what the men were after, Petri's heart. A later autopsy confirmed that the heart was indeed missing, and so the men pulled it out, splitting and tearing it from its fleshy moorings. And though this man was supposedly dead, they said the heart was still bulging with blood. In fact, they told reporters that the cavity of Petri's chest was like a pool of blood. And when the heart was removed, they even claimed that the body relaxed, and in the gaunt quiet, they heard Petri let out an eerie sigh. They drove wooden stakes into the body and sprinkled the corpse with garlic. Some reports say that they gently laid the corpse back into the grave, though some locals have disputed this. They said that the cadaver was simply left there in a, quote, filthy state. Whatever they did, it just didn't end there. The men dropped the heart into a plastic bag, and they took it to a crossroads where the troubled relatives of Petri were waiting. And here they brought out the heart and impaled it on one of the spikes of the pitchfork. And then they dangled his heart over a fire, singeing it with flames. And then they took that scorched heart back to the village and back to Gorge's daughter's house. Remember, this was the young woman who'd been troubled with the spirit of Petri, trying to eat her at night. And so they built a second fire in the house, and they cooked the heart on it. Once done, they took the ashes and mixed it with boiling water to create a bizarre tea. And they passed this grisly cocktail to the woman and said, "Drink." And she did. Meanwhile, Petri's daughter discovered what had happened to the corpse of her father, and so she reported it to the police, who promptly arrested the men. They were given a joint fine of 900 euros and sentenced to 6 months in jail for grave desecration and the illegal exhuming of a corpse. And yet, none of the men actually served that sentence. Why? Well, I learned that in this rural, superstitious area, this was not an uncommon event. Investigators estimated that there may well have been 20 such Strigoi rituals in the past few years. Indeed, reporters were shocked at how relaxed some of the locals were about this incident. An 80-year-old villager called Tudor Stoke told reporters this ritual takes place but in secret, within the family. The problem comes when the police get involved. Another local called Anishwara Constantine was quoted as saying, "Well, the sick woman got better again, so they must have been doing something right." The press struggled to find anybody who would openly condemn what the men had done that night. For in that particular rural community, they believed in the reality of the Strigoi. And as I listened to Doris tell me those stories in that Transylvanian tavern that night, I noticed a common thread running through them. The reason these dead people come back as evil spirits is often because they have some sort of unfinished matter to attend to, a mortal enemy unforgiven, a love affair yet resolved. And so to avoid this situation, I learned that locals in Romania have invented cultural solutions that sound positively ghoulish to the outsider. A vivid example is a ritual that is carried out called Nunta Mortului, which in English means the weddings of the dead. Imagine a young lady of marriageable age dies suddenly, perhaps due to a car accident or tragic illness. Being young, she has not been able to fulfill some of her traditional roles expected of women in certain cultures, i.e., she had no time to be married. This is seen as unfinished business. The fear, therefore, for some is that this young woman will be so eager to fulfill her societal role as a wife, she may well return as a Strigoi to search for a husband, even after death. To avoid this spectral menace, the funerals of such women can include a symbolic wedding service, where a local man, a friend, or just a willing volunteer gets married to the corpse. The idea is that the spirit of this young woman will know that her relational issues have been put right before death, allowing her to rest peacefully in the ground as a dead wife. There are many other rituals that ensure that a dead person will pass to the other side without the desire for return. For example, at some funerals, the ritual feast of Pomana is held at the site of the grave. Here, a special white cake called kolava is actually fed to the corpse, perhaps because if the dead die full, they may not come back hungry for a bite. Another custom is that when a person dies, a family will take the utmost care that a cat does not come into the room. For if a cat walks over the body of a dead loved one, their soul may well return as a Strigoi. Sometimes a knitting needle is pushed through the heart of the dead person to ensure they don't return. And in one curious custom, a piece of iron is placed under the tongue of the deceased, and the following words said over the corpse: "Only after you finish eating this can you then eat me." The Strigoi are sometimes seen as the spirits or the actual walking bodies of a dead relative, but these creatures can return in other forms too. Those who die in pain or regret are said to return as a dog or a cat to torment their relatives. Perhaps that explains why I saw so many wild dogs walking the streets of the Transylvanian village in which I was staying. Might they be dogs, or might they actually be the dead locals roaming the streets on all fours? One solution, apparently, is to bury a corpse with a bottle of whiskey. The Strigoi will drink it and get so enamored by the liquor that they won't bother returning home. It's a small price to pay to prevent Grandpa from climbing your stairs each night. Of course, many of these folklore traditions are dying out, and there are plenty who would laugh in Romania at these ideas. And yet the case of Petre Toma reminds us that the idea persists in certain rural communities. During my time in Transylvania, I learned that the folklore of Romania is complex and varied, with various legends overlapping. So, for example, some would not use the word Strigoi to describe these creatures. Instead, they would call them the moroi. Others may even use that more familiar term, vampire. And yet, the principle tends to remain the same. The dead return to feed off the living, to hurt them, especially family. It's almost like the love they had for their relatives has died along with their heartbeat, and what is left is a kind of malevolence. For example, there is a legend of children who die in tragic circumstances such as drowning or suffocation. It's said that these little ones may well return at night and creep into their parents' bedrooms. But is it to say a last farewell? To gaze upon their parents with love and affection? No. It's said that these dead children sit on their parents' chest as they sleep, actively pushing down to try and stop Mummy and Daddy from breathing. As I drove around the villages of Transylvania, I saw elaborately painted wooden crosses nailed to tree trunks or at crossroads. In the little room in which I was staying, I opened the drawer by my bed to find a wooden crucifix and an Egyptian Ankh symbol. Guess it's good to cover the bases. Tourists might be forgiven for thinking all these crosses are just gimmicks for Dracula tourism, or even for a genuine fear of vampires. And yet Doris told me that they are usually to protect the people from the devil himself. In fact, some of the locals refuse to even allow their newborn babies to be taken out of the house until they are baptized. Otherwise, Satan may take control of their little ones. At the end of that night, I asked Doris if she thinks that all this folklore will die out one day. And she nodded and said, yeah, give it time. These old legends will filter out just like they have in the West. Yet when I pressed her on it, she admitted that she was not ready to ignore the old traditions too much. She said, just in case. Later, when we were done with the interview, she smiled broadly and let me see the ring on her finger. It was good news. She'd just gotten engaged the day before, and her face was full of laughter and light, and so we drank together in celebration. Yet, as I saw that ring glistening in the tavern's light, I was glad that at least for her the business of marriage had been resolved. Better that than my generous host returned to this village one night as a stalking, love-struck Strigoi. The Strigoi appear to be a strange mix of ghost, demon, zombie, or vampire. It's this last idea that particularly resonates in a land like Transylvania. After all, the word Strigoi is thought to originate from the Greek word strix, which describes an evil spirit bird that feeds on human blood. Yet the Strigoi appear to be a little more complex than vampires in some ways. They are more personal, more vindictive. They seem to return after death to torment their own families, to drain the life not just from anybody, but from their loved ones, which may explain why there was so little shame or remorse that night among the 6 men who gathered in the cemetery to dig up and mutilate the corpse of Petre Toma. Gorge Marinescu, the family member who led the men to the graveyard that night, put it this way to reporters. He said, "We performed a ritual that is hundreds of years old. We had no idea we were committing a crime. On the contrary, we believed that we were doing a good thing because the spirit of Petre was haunting us all and was very close to killing some of us. He came back from the dead and was after us." And what about you, listening to my voice right now? Do you have any unfinished business tonight? Perhaps you better sort that out before it's too late. Because if you die with a bulging to-do list, watch out. You may come back as a Strigoi. Keep the terror flowing by hopping into this frightful video. And if you want to know more about me, then why not check out peterlaws.co.uk. But for now, keep an eye on the shadows. They might just have their eyes on you. Good night.